Welcome. Get started in a minute here. Just want to make sure everything is set up to our satisfaction. All right. Well, welcome to this live stream. We're going to talk a bit about imagination as a form of knowing. And I'll go into things like fantasy, creativity, application, and I'll have some exercises for you. So welcome to this live stream. I want to mention, if you want to be informed of other YouTube activities I do, feel free to subscribe. It's free. And also, if you want to know what I'm up to elsewhere, so lectures, classes, and in fact, I have a new class idea I want to talk to you about at the end of this. Things that I'm doing, presentations. If you go to my website, chalkwist.com, you should see a pop-up, the only one, in about 10 to 15 seconds, and it'll let you sign up for my events newsletter. I don't spam people. I just send it out once a month. I'm thinking about sending it out maybe once or twice more often, just when special things happen. But usually it's once a month, and it just talks about what I'm up to. So feel free to sign up for that. So we're talking about one of my favorite topics today. And I want to start with a little personal anecdote to kind of get us into the discussion of especially the usefulness of imagination, but we're going to go much deeper than that. So the year is 1999, and I just told my dad that I'm going to sign up and study depth psychology at the graduate level, PhD level. Depth psychology looks at the relations between conscious and unconscious. And names that pop up in terms of the founding of depth psychology, Pierre Janet, he doesn't get mentioned enough, actually, so I keep doing it. Usually you hear Freud and Jung, right? Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and many others. So psychoanalysis is one thing that comes out of that. So he was puzzled by this, and he said, why would you want to do that? So I gave him some reasons. And one of the things I mentioned to him was, I'd really like to know more about the psychology of imagination. So it wasn't that this surprised him, because in both my birth and adoptive families, I'm kind of the person singled out as the family dreamer. The visionary guy's over there, go talk to him or whatever. But what he asked me was, how in the world will you ever make any money from it? Which is what parents often ask. And it's an understandable question. They don't want you to be broke. And I said, I don't know. But my intuition tells me I should do this, so I'm going to do it. So fast forward several years. And so I'm at this point, I'm teaching a lot at the graduate level, some undergrad. I'm doing lectures that are paid. I'm publishing books. I did a count recently, by the way. I'm up to 17. That's 3 of those are co-edited, and the rest are my books. But what else? Corporate consulting opportunities, personal consulting opportunities. So when I reached that point, I said, hey, Dad, remember when you asked me if this had any practical utility? And he was like, yeah, you know. So I enjoyed that. Now, taking this well beyond me, I have some numbers I want to read to you. And feel free to repeat them and what I just said, and even share this video. When you come across people who don't like the fact that you're imaginative, or the words that go along with it, visionary, dreamy, whatever, feel free to show them this, or repeat the argument, or even come up with your own. But this is just the numbers, right? So this is the shallowest part of our presentation today, but I think it's still important. All right, so if you want to play along with me here, There's about a 15-second delay in the chat, but I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to feel free to just immediately guess off the top of your head. So, how much money do you think, let's see, oops, I'm at the wrong part here. Let me go up. All right, how much money do you think Pokemon made since its inception in 1996? That's the question. Just guess. How much money did Pokemon make since it began? That's the question. The next one, if you want to take on another one, and 2 million, there's our first guess. All right. You're nowhere near the ballpark. It's a great guess. There's nothing wrong with it. Winnie the Pooh. So there's your second one. Mickey Mouse and Friends. And Star Wars. All right. I'm going to repeat those. So Pokemon was the first one. We've got a guess at 2 million. Winnie the Pooh, that came out in 1924. Mickey Mouse came out in 1928, and Star Wars, of course, way more recent, 1977. Especially seems recent to people my age. But all right, so let me give you the numbers. So Pokemon has made $77.1 billion since it started. All right. And this is through merchandise, mobile games, box office. It says jet aircraft livery sales. I have no idea what that means, but that's worth 3 million. So it started out as a video game, and obviously heavily implicated. You know, if you didn't consciously draw on powers of imagination, there'd be none of these things that I'm mentioning. Winnie the Pooh, 73.7 billion. Mickey Mouse, 66.7 billion. Star Wars, 65 billion. Let's have a recent one, more recent. So Marvel got started, the Marvel Universe, actually, the cinematic universe. The comics have been around for a while, but that got started in 2008, 40.8 billion. The whole world of Harry Potter, the wizarding world, it started as a novel, 32 billion. So, and there's many other examples. I think Star Trek is worth about 10 billion since it started. Tolkien, about 6 billion, if I remember correctly. Now, the interesting thing about this to me is not just the amounts of money, which are enormous, but listen to how these got started. Picture book. And I'm mentioning other ones too. There's this long list that I'm not going to bother reading you. You can look it up. But picture book, film, novel, video game, animated series, comic book. There's a few here with that. Yeah, so I mean, you can see for yourself that just in terms of the practicality question or making a living, I mean, these numbers are way beyond making a living, right? And there's also a little anecdote about J.R.R. Tolkien, who started all this, his version of this, by writing some stories just to read his kids at bedtime. That's how The Hobbit got started. And then people like C.S. Lewis saw what he was writing. He showed it to him, and they said, you have to publish this. So he published that, and then The Lord of the Rings, which originally was one big book. And then the publisher insisted that it be cut up into 3. So at one point when he was getting popular, he was taken on a tour of the publishing house. And he went into this one room, and there were books stacked to the roof on every side. And he said, wow, whose books are these? And they said, of course, yours. And that was his first inkling that he was onto something really big through the power of fantasy. So, imagination's not practical? No. Taking this in other directions, just beside the whole money point, there's some evolutionary thinkers, scientists, biologists, other people who surmise that imagination evolved so that we could anticipate potentially dangerous situations instead of actually having to do them. You know, the person with no imagination who runs into a grassland where there's smoke coming up on the other end is in danger of being burned to death by a wildfire. And this is still true. I was out driving on the freeway once, and I saw way down the road. It was a very busy day. There was a lot of traffic. Everybody was going kind of slow. And way down the road, I saw some flashing red lights, and I went, uh-oh. So I started imagining and putting more distance between me and the car ahead. And suddenly I heard this bang, 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 bang coming toward me. All the people in front of me, or not all of them, but a lot of them, they didn't brake in time. So they were slamming into each other. So I was glad that I had looked ahead, literally, and imagined what might be happening, and then let some distance happen between me and the next car, so I wouldn't not only be a casualty, but then the people behind me as well, right? So the idea here is that imagination is not only selected for, but those of us who are around today are the offspring of the more imaginative people, the dreamers, right? That's kind of a interesting way to think of it. Um, the U.S. military, in its warfighting policies, has this culture in place that it doesn't always observe, but it exists as an ideal, where people who are in the chain of command in the battle space, so down on the level of sergeants and people who are actually out doing the fighting, right? The idea here is that they always be allowed to have space to innovate, because things happen on the battlefield and in the battle space rapidly. And so there isn't time to go consult some higher up about, should I do this? Should I do that? So one of the things they look for is commanding officers who can go, let's do this, and be imaginative, right? So there's a military use. In business, this usually looks like innovation. A lot of emphasis on that. We're going to talk about that more too in a minute. So all of these to refute the idea that imagination is not practical. It's nonsense. In fact, try to think of something that humanity's achieved that didn't involve imagination. You can't. Nobody just invents something without thinking, right? Thinking ahead. So that's one canard that comes up. Another one is that there are certain people who don't have imagination. That's impossible. We all have it. And some of you are familiar with Jung's typology, his psychological types. So we've all heard of introverts and extroverts, but it gets more complex than that. And out of that comes the Myers-Briggs typology. So there's an axis that I'd like to see included. And it has to do with, I actually call it the axis of imagination. So on one end of it are people I think of as here dreamers, Here, here dreamers, and on the other, their dreamers. And these aren't opposites. This isn't polarized. We all have a little of both, right? Here dreamers, like my dad, for instance, their imagination tends to be in facts, data, things, not so much in possibilities. And when I would see my dad in his workshop, I could tell the full focus of his imagination was on stuff he was making. He would just dream stuff up, but he did it with his hands. So that's here dreaming. They're dreaming, and if you haven't guessed already, I'm a little on that, more on that end of the spectrum. Their dreaming is worlds of possibility, fantasy realms of being. We're the kind of people who read Lord of the Rings. Both my parents are here dreamers. They can't stand any of that stuff. I love it. So, but we need everybody, right? Everybody's got imagination. We need both kinds. So that to say that everybody's got imagination. There's no such thing as people aren't imaginative. Everybody's got it. And then one last thing I want to deal with, and then let's talk about what the heck is Imagiknowing, right? So escapism is a term you often hear. People say, well, I don't read that stuff, or I don't watch those TV shows because it's just escapist. So I have a couple of responses to that. The first is, what's wrong with escapism? If you've been working all day in some grinding job with a boss you can't stand and work that you don't like, maybe your mental health needs a break. Maybe escapism is the only place where you feel like who you are, right? I mean, I remember when the first studies came out, people are spending all this time in games online, and now we've got VR and stuff like that. I wasn't the slightest bit surprised. I had a corporate job, and there are corporate jobs that are cool and creative, and there are corporate jobs that are just drudgery. They're basically factories with a suit, you know? And I hated my corporate job. The first one I had, 14 years of drudgery right out of college. I should have quit sooner. So I too took refuge in fantasy, science fiction, things like that. Also, escapism in terms of intolerable imagination killing social conditions. The only use that big pieces of our culture, this wonderful American culture, have for fantasy is making money of the kinds of amounts that I started talking about earlier. So when you think about all the influences, and not only in our culture but around the world, that attack and kill the imagination, it's sort of like attacking and killing the soul. Is it any wonder people can't stand it and they want to get off by themselves somewhere? And there's also an additional point I'd like to make here, which is, and this one comes from Tolkien himself. He says in one of his essays that an escape from prison, in other words, escaping into fantasy, should not be confused with the flight of the deserter. These are different, as we would now say, they're different psychologies, right? If you're in prison, as he puts it in the essay, he says, of course you want to escape and you want to take as many people with you as you can, right? So it can be a problem. There's people that spend so much time online gaming, whatever it is, daydreaming, that yes, they might lose a bit of touch with reality, but there are actually worse things that can happen to a person. So, you know, the thing should be studied itself as a symptom, like what's going on underneath, where imagination isn't really claiming its due. We're not giving it enough time. And is this a response to that? I think that if the worlds of education, business, culture, religion made adequate room for imagination, fantasy, and creativity, there wouldn't be any escapism because there wouldn't be anything to escape from, right? So let's go to Imagiknowing and what that's all about. So it's a word I coined. I looked around to see if there was one already, and I couldn't find one. And Imagiknowing, to me, is a very simple way of saying it, is it refers to imagination as a form of knowledge, especially deep knowledge. It is an engagement with the unseen, with possibilities. It's a kind of mental conjuring beyond the limits of the actual. And so that's the imagination part. So it moves from the actual to the possible. And to imagine in many ways is to envision. And to fantasize is to do it playfully. So a distinction I would make is that imagination and Imagiknowing are the base. They're the foundation. Fantasy is one of the results. And fantasy is often about things that we find enjoyable, things that we daydream about, and that can go deep in a big hurry, by the way. So, but it's essential that it preserve an aspect of being playful. So Imagiknowing as growing into the foundations of our life, our work, our relationships, our place in the world, our ancestry. Another way of saying this is that Imagiknowing uses imagination and fantasy as forms of gnosis, direct, experiential, deep, embodied contact and intuitive contact with the world. It's a whole person way of perceiving the world. That word gnosis is Greek, and it's had different meanings. The Greeks had different words for different kinds of knowing. So episteme, that's a more theoretical knowing. Techne is a more technical kind of knowing, like when you learn a technical skill. Gnosis, around maybe the first to the third centuries in Alexandria, got taken over by a group of people who used imagination as a sort of spiritual illumination. They were esoteric practitioners and storytellers. So gnosis was one of their goals, one of the goals of their stories and practices. So let me say a little bit about that. And I'm periodically looking at chat, so if you got questions, go ahead and put them in. So Alexandria was an amazing place, is an amazing place. It's like this alchemical crucible or cauldron where all kinds of things ferment, and it's always been that way. And at one point, Egyptian religion, which had this huge creative aspect to it, especially among priestly artisans who worked in what were called houses of life. They're usually defined as scriptoriums. Today we would call them libraries, but there were much more than that. They were repositories of lore and wisdom, and also art. Alchemy comes out of that practice as a sacred art, as an art of not just decorating, but preparing statues for the inhabitation of the gods themselves, as it was seen in Egyptian religion. And there was all kinds of metal work, gold work, chemistry happening, stuff today we would say is scientific. And so all of this gradually changes form and it moves into what was called Hermeticism. So I won't say much about that because I've done a ton of videos on this and you can just look it up and get a definition. But it's a wisdom path that is based in part on imagination. And so when Egyptian priests used to pray in the morning, at midday, in the evening, and perhaps other days as well, they would express gratitude toward what they thought of as Atum, the ultimate God, and he had different names too. And he in quotes, not gendered, right? He in quotes. So in their prayers, which were connected with their art, there was also an element of creativity. They would recite sacred vows, things like that. So the question, can Imagiknowing be an aspect of prayer? Absolutely, it can. So this moves into Hermeticism, which is an embodied wisdom path, clear speech, clear thought, philosophy as lived, not just abstract systems. That came later in European history. And then other things occur as a result, like Gnosticism, which is biblical Hermeticism. The Romantic philosophers and poets took up some of these themes. The Renaissance, of course, imagination and natural magic were huge in the Renaissance. Depth psychology owes a big debt to Hermeticism. And Jung talked a lot about active imagination, where let's say that you have a dream that you don't understand. And by the way, this is a practice you can do. And there's a particular image that's puzzling to you. What might this image mean? So you put yourself in sort of a daydreamy place. And when you're in that reflective mood, you invite whoever the image is or whatever it is back in so that you can visualize it, imagine it. And you patiently stay with it until the image moves or speaks or somebody else shows up and says something about it. You wait for the scene to activate itself. And in doing this, you're actually, from Jung's standpoint, you're encouraging the unconscious to rise up and say something. So you're experiencing whatever is happening with this symbol as a whole person, not just your conscious mind or your ego. So people who are really good at this, which Jung was, after a while can step into the imaginal reality. You kind of mentally go into whatever scene you're imagining and actually interact with the symbols and the characters and the figures. And they'll speak to you and they'll tell you things you didn't know about yourself or about the situation that you're asking about. So Jung fashioned this into an actual practice. The Gnostics were thought to have done something similar. So in terms of Imagiknowing, there's a distinction I want to make between what I think of as different aspects of it. So a chronological distinction is maybe a good way of saying it. So imagination, fantasy, creativity, and innovation. That's what I want to kind of go through. Like, what do these have to do with each other? So imagination, as I said before, is the base. And if we're using it for knowledge, for deep knowledge, then Imagiknowing. Fantasy is the activity of it, and it's fun, it's playful, it should be. There are fantasies that are disturbing and difficult and hard, so we shouldn't leave that out of account. But Fantasizing, when we do it for something we desire or hope for, can be pleasant, and it can work like active imagination. Actually, things can show up that you don't expect. So fantasy is an engagement of the imagination. This can lead to creativity, making new things. And so when the fantasy gets expressed somehow, when it gets into a form outside of us, especially, then we start talking about creativity. And creativity isn't confined to the arts and crafts, although obviously it shows up big there. And Marvel doesn't have a monopoly on it either. So there's creative ways of arranging where you live. There's creativity in the workplace. There's creativity in relationships. So taking whatever currently exists and making something new of it could be one way of thinking about creativity. And again, we all have it, all of us. And so when the creativity actually does lead to something changed, when it makes a substantial change in the world, then we talk about innovation. So in the place of work and business and finance, usually they go right to innovation because that's closest to the result. Let's innovate, let's adapt, let's think up new ideas, for increasing revenue, for adapting to changing market conditions, whatever it is, right? But in order to do that, there has to be a few things in place. So we have to go back in time a little bit in order to innovate, we have to engage our creativity. In order to do that, we have to fantasize. And in order to do that, we have to be in touch with our own imagination. So it has to be honored somehow, not just used, whether it's to make money or to adapt to situations or whatever. There's a term that I've started using called imaginal liberty. And I have a couple of different things I mean by that. One is, in the world of imagination, you can do anything, right? So that kind of freedom. But also freedom on the side of the imagination itself, meaning respecting it as an autonomous power and treating it with respect instead of just chaining it to whatever project we have. And you might have noticed yourself that when you start using your imagination like a resource, when you start digging at it the way you might be mining for metals or something, it starts drying up. Writers sometimes complain about writer's block, or you can have different kinds of blocks in the workplace. When that happens, it's not always because imagination is refusing to operate, but it might be. So it's good to do a self-check. Am I really treating my imagination with the respect that it deserves? It's a part of me that has its own needs, the way the body does, right? If we disrespect the body, there's symptoms. So same thing with imagination, with thought, with other human capacities. Imagination can lead to innovation if it lives in a fairly open structure. And I don't mean totally unstructured, but because there has to be some kind of guidelines and rules in the workplace, for instance. Or artists often talk about having a discipline that helps them be creative. So we need some structure, but we also need some openness. So if you're in a situation where there's this mentality that, okay, if it doesn't directly make us money, it's forbidden, right? That's a good way to kill creativity altogether and innovation. So there needs to be openness, there needs to be education in terms of how to align with this resource and do well by it. We have to have resources available so that we can actually turn it into real things. I remember coming across a few situations in my corporate life where I would come up with an idea and a manager would say, wow, that's a great idea, we should really do that. And then nothing would happen, right? And then other managers would actually get behind me and say, okay, here's the resources we have available for this. What can you do with them? And then I would get my award for changing some process. So there needs to be, I think, above all, a culture of acceptance, that even when strange things come out of the imagination, then we accept that. We don't necessarily act on it or create them, but we do tend them. So a good mindset to have is that nothing that comes out of imagination is wrong. No matter how bizarre, how evil seeming, how dangerous seeming, it's not wrong. What's wrong is what we do with it. And people have done horrible things with imagination, as we all know. There's a company I heard about some time ago called IDEO. They're a design firm on the San Francisco Peninsula. And they, at least in terms of how they present themselves, I don't know anyone who works there, but their reputation is an organization that really respects imagination. And so the people who work there design their own workspaces. There's an amusing documentary that ABC News did some years ago where it had a brief scene where some people in this one working team said, you know, it would be really cool if we had an airplane wing stuck to the wall just because. So they funded it, and there's this big wing sticking out of the wall just to be bizarre, you know. They have made many things that are in everyday use. And part of what they rely on is the idea that if you trust people to be imaginative and you gather together diverse kinds of expertise, then good things will flow from that. So it's both idealistic and practical. So let me go through a few questions about what imagination and Imagiknowing address. And then I'll give you a couple more ideas for some practices. And then I'll mention the class that I wanted to talk about. I'm still thinking about how it might look. So feel free to put questions in the chat. I will get to them. So questions that Imagiknowing addresses: is there not more awaiting me beyond this kind of life? It's a good imagination question, right? Is there not more if you need more? Am I ready to go on a search for inspirations I can act on? What could give me a sense of meaning? What do I feel called on to create, and how? What story am I in? And how might I contribute to it instead of being lived by it? What would it feel like to live in a world of living presences rather than mute objects? And instead of divisiveness and helplessness as alternatives, how can I be involved in something practical and visionary? So sometimes we suffer from dried up well springs of imagination, and I just have a few ideas to get them going. One of them is daydreaming. If you've lost the art of daydreaming, you need to get it back. You'll be happier, actually. One of the things, as indicated earlier, that can kill imagination is immediately making it practical. So, I mean, there's all kinds of practical reasons to daydream. Innovation comes from it. You know, it relaxes you. It allows you to envision possibilities. There's tons of reasons. But you want to put the reasoning mind away for a little bit and just fantasize and see what happens. So just fantasizing. If you can't do that out of the blue because you feel kind of locked up, then think of those situations in life or in fiction where there's something incomplete. What story comes to mind to move that plot forward for you? And write it down or tell it to somebody. So one of the things I like to do occasionally is just go out and to some public place and people watch and try to see if I can get a sense of the people walking by, like who are they, where do they come from, what's their history, stuff like that, you know. So just look at a couple of people and then make up a story, a short one, like who are they, what are their names, where did they come from, just to get the wheels turning, right? Another thing you can do is you can take a couple of fictional characters that you like from a film, from a novel, wherever they come from, and put them together and imagine the conversation they would have. What would that sound like? What else you can do? You can restory a dream. So let's say that you think up a dream and it has kind of an ambiguous ending or it stops suddenly. Write down a continuation of it and see what happens. And if you want to go big with this, you can either do active imagination, like I talked about earlier, or you can ask yourself the question, what would be the kind of world I want to be a part of. So if you could transport yourself into a future of your desire, a world of your desire, what would it actually be like? And write about it. So all of this is part of the work that I do, which I referred to as world reading these days. It's gone through different iterations, and I've talked about that in other videos. World reading is a kind of lived philosophy with psychology, ecology, and some other fields in it. But it's not highly technical. It's more a field of practice, and it's quite rooted in imagination as knowing. So I was sitting recently thinking, I'd really like to teach a class outside the academic world, which I've done before. And it'd be nice to teach an online class, and it might meet, let's say, twice a month, maybe second and fourth Friday at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, maybe. And Friday is a pretty good day for me, although I'd be open to other ones. And I pick 4 because I don't want it to be too much later because I have to eat dinner. So does everybody else in my time zone. But that tends to be a good time for somebody in the Pacific area reaching across time zones. It's not perfect, and I'm totally open to other possibilities. I actually like working in the morning better, and I'd be putting some work into this class. So the way it's going to look, and I've got a title for it. I want to call it Restorying in Depth. Restorying in Depth meets for, let's say, hour and a half, twice a month, and it would be about all these things I've been talking about and other aspects of the work I've done over the years. So we could talk about things like managing eco anxiety and have a few weeks on that, because that's really up for a lot of us right now. We could talk about utopic visioning and how do we move from dreaming up the kind of world we want to live in to actually making it happen, right? There's something I did a podcast about, and if you go to my website, chalkwist.com/podcast, you should see it by the end of the month. And the title of it is something like, Why Don't Things Change? And I don't know about you, but I'm really tired of the same old traffic jams, the same old BS in the political world, the crises that go on and on. It's like we can never get our act together as a people, Why is that? And the other side of it, what are imaginative and creative ways in which some things have changed? And can we learn about that? So that's sort of a sub theme of this class I'm thinking up. What makes for lasting change that's also enjoyable, that's fulfilling, that helps us mature as human beings? And we can have that also as a topic. Look at different aspects of that. I've done a lot of work with personal myth. I'm trained as a family therapist, so we could talk about family dynamics, particularly in terms of stories that get handed down through the generations, stories and motifs and images. A term I've been using is archetypal family systems, so we could get into that. There's a profession I'd like to see happen with other people besides me, and called lorology, how to look at people's guiding stories and our own, and look at the lore that powers them, and what creative choices can we make with that so that we go in new directions. That's part of the consulting that I've done in the corporate world too, by the way. I wish I had known about it when I was practicing psychotherapy, but I hadn't got that far yet. And the whole power of storytelling to influence more than facts and figures. So we could look at that. That's just a scattering of all the things that we can do in this class. But the main thing I want people to come away with is some sort of deep, not just transformation, but transmutation, which is an alchemical term for change that goes all the way down, change that lasts. That's what I really want to focus on. And there's so many ways to do it, but all of them are mediated one way or the other through imagination. So I think that'll do it for today. If there's any more questions, feel free to reach out to me at my website, chalkwist.com. And I recorded this, so it'll go up in a little bit, and you'll be able to have access to it that way. But let me know if you're interested in this restoring class. And I should mention one other thing that's important, the cost of it, right? So those of you who've followed my work for some time know that I try to keep things reasonable as far as cost goes. I don't like charging an arm and a leg, but I do like making a living. A lot of us have to. So the cost depends on how many people sign up. So if you know people who are interested in this, tell them about it. And I'll be doing, maybe in a week or so, I'll be doing a video specifically on what this class can be about. You've just got a preview of it. So more detail in about a week, I think. I'll post it at YouTube. Send it around on social media too. So go ahead and contact me. Oh, I should give you my email address too. It's my name. So Craig@chalkwist.com. And I'll just type it into the chat here real quick too. Craig@chalkwist.com. And just let me know if you're interested and what your availability would be in terms of good times to do this. So one last thing. I'm going to do more YouTube videos on this topic of Imagiknowing, so look out for that too. I try to post something about once every week or so. I spent a long time not being very active in YouTube, and now I'm picking up the pace. So if you subscribe, you'll get warned about it. So take care, everybody.